Is there something on the technology journey that you're on that you can monetize before your final product without having to do very much incremental engineering or incremental production work? It'll never be zero, and you'll always be diverting resources a little bit. But the earlier that you can get to some sort of revenue, I believe that's better.
Welcome to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast. Too many advanced science and engineering companies fail to deliver their innovations from the lab to the market. We are on a mission to change that. My name is Chris Reichhelm, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deep Tech Leaders. Each week, we speak with some of the world's leading entrepreneurs, investors, corporates, and policymakers about what it takes to succeed on the lab to market journey. Join us. I've been reflecting on lab to market journeys for the last 14 years. And I've been doing that in the context of my role as an executive recruiter. I've been a recruiter for much longer, for over 30 years, and focused on startups and spinouts for the last 25 years, always focused on advanced science and engineering. And the reason for reflecting on the lab to market journey is so that I can develop a keener sense of the skills, experience, and talents that are required at each stage of that journey, so that companies generate and develop the right profiles, so that they have a better chance of hiring the right people, and they have a better chance of accomplishing their goals. One of the ways we learn about what works in the lab to market journey is by studying companies. That's not unusual. And generally, we focus on, if I look at most of the deep tech companies we get to study, they're generally in between TRL 4 or 5 and TRL 7. And I would venture to say that most of the deep tech companies that are out there today sit between that, between early pilots or early prototypes and advanced pilots. And then you see a sharp cutaway when you get to commercial grade first of a kinds, TRL 8. And you see a sharper fall away still when you get to market ready products. And true TRL 9, and then advanced settings in manufacturing readiness levels, commercial readiness levels, and so on. And remember, our goal in the deep tech industry, if you're trying to build up deep tech companies, our goal is to create companies that become active value chain participants, supplying other companies. So this means that there is a dearth of active, mature deep tech companies in the market today. DeepMind, yes. SpaceX, Cerebras, NVIDIA. But beyond that, maybe Tesla. Beyond that, there aren't that many. So we have to learn from the failures. And there are two companies in Europe that I'm going to be talking about today. One of which is Lilium, the electric vehicle takeoff and landing company, the Aerospace company from Germany. And the other one is Arrival. And both of these companies, when they set out, were actually super exciting. They had bold missions. They employed thousands of people. They raised lots of money. I think Lilium raised over $1 billion, maybe $1.5 billion. Arrival was around $1 billion, I think. They both listed on NASDAQ, or they both reversed into a SPAC, so it was SPAC listings. And they both achieved unicorn status. So these were super exciting companies. And over the last 2 years, both have gone into insolvency. And so what can we learn from the failures? What can we learn from Arrival and Lilium? Because these companies actually got pretty far. Helping me understand this today is James Arnold. James is an executive I've had the pleasure of knowing for a little while now. And he served in senior strategy, operational, and engineering roles within both companies. And so I'm delighted to be able to talk to James today and understand what actually happened within those organizations, how far they really got, and what we should be learning from those. If you're interested in the space, if you're committed to all of us doing better on the lab to market journey, you've got to watch this. Let's get into it. James Arnold, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Good to be here.
It's we're in August 2025, and you've worked for two of, in my view, Europe's more exciting deep tech companies, because I think these companies really embodied the spirit of deep tech as so many see it. They were tackling bold, big challenges, bold visions. Lilium and Arrival. We're going to kind of dive deep into the whys and wherefores and whats and so on. But as you kind of stand back from your experience in these companies, what are some of the headline impressions or observations that you have from your time there?
So, as you say, they're both very exciting European companies, right? Tackling important problems, raising lots of money, hiring lots of amazing people. I think one thing that is consistent, and I think we're going to talk more about this, is that they both grew quite big, quite quickly after raising, various different funding rounds, even from quite early stage. And I think there's something interesting to talk about there. Of course, there's nothing wrong with growing, right? But there's something consistent there that I think is interesting. In the one case, Arrival, there's also something to talk about around focus and knowing what product it is that you're really developing. And there are some aspects around product requirements and so on, which I've just been thinking about, which are related to Lilium as well. So I think there are a few common threads in each case.
Yeah. I find the comment on growth interesting. Growth is okay. Growth is good. We need growth.
Growth is good.
We're not going to get far without growth. But I think in the venture world in particular, and so much of the venture world, as you and I have discussed before, has been defined by its experience with software and SaaS and the dynamics of that industry, which are very, very different, are totally different from the dynamics of deep tech. But nevertheless, we kind of superimpose the playbook. We tend to superimpose that playbook over deep tech and then assume, but with certain caveats, that we're going to see a similar
outcome
kind of model. And so the kind of, to quote Reid Hoffman's book, the Blitzscaling and the go for growth at all costs and raise as much as you can and hire like hell, even if you don't know where you are directionally, where you're going, even if you're not sure product market fit, even if you don't know what that early application is going to be or what that first product, or even if you don't have all the answers figured out, it doesn't matter. Just grow. And it makes, and maybe you can make allowances for that in software. I don't know enough about the industry. Maybe you can. But in these industries, I just don't know that that's true.
No, I don't think it is true. I think it's super risky. And there are all sorts of things that happen when you start to grow your company beyond a certain size, right? And many of those things are negative, or at least they're difficult to manage. It's interesting you mentioned Reid Hoffman. I came across Paul Graham has these bunch of essays that he wrote about things, and one of them is called "What Makes Startups Fail." And one of the items in there is actually growth in terms of team growth. And one comment in there stood out for me. He says, when you grow your team, your startup moves to the suburbs and has kids, which I thought was quite funny as a kind of observation about what happens.
That's so funny.
I think obviously what he's getting at is it's not really a startup anymore, right? It's no longer agile. It has certain risks maybe that it didn't have before, and definitely there are pressures. People can put pressures on an organization to grow for the sake of it. I do believe that this is something that some investors believe. This is something that you'll hear from some people, that just growing the team to a certain extent adds value on its own, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Maybe it does in the sense that it makes other people perceive the organization as a big and successful organization. And I think maybe it does in the sense that, in theory, it gives you this capability that you talk about, right? Okay, maybe we got the product wrong, but it doesn't matter because we've got 1,000 engineers. So if we have to do a car instead of a plane, we can, in theory, we can do that. And I think, of course, there's value in hiring a great team, right? But also,
sure,
it's not quite as simple as that, obviously. In terms of
it's not as simple as that. Let's talk about you a little bit. How did you kind of find your way into this industry or these industries? Where did all of this start for you?
So, as you know, I've been an engineer kind of my whole career, and I spent a long while in consultancy. At some point, I wanted to work less with big companies and more with small ones. Let's put it like that.
And just so we're clear, sorry to interrupt, but just so we're clear, some of those big consultancies were McKinsey.
Yeah, so I worked at McKinsey for a little bit over seven years, and always on product development, engineering, manufacturing, operational topics, and across many different industries. But obviously, McKinsey's clients tend to be FTSE 100 or equivalent type companies. And these companies have their own, pros and cons and sort of structures and cultures that are somewhat different to the startup world. And just personally, I find smaller companies or earlier stage companies a little bit more interesting. And so, when I decided to step away from McKinsey, I went in that sort of direction, seeking out some, opportunities to work with smaller companies. And I was lucky enough to come across Lilium and meet the founders there through one of our mutual friends, and was very excited by what they were doing. And indeed, was a very interesting engineering solution to a very important problem and question. So I wasn't necessarily seeking aerospace or even seeking these kind of deep tech companies, but more ways to build on the operational and engineering background that I had, but with smaller, more dynamic, more sort of exciting companies.
Okay. So you have, and just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, you've got a mechanical engineering degree from Imperial. You then, over time, you join up with McKinsey. The kinds of work you're doing there in product development, is it mostly of the mechanical engineering variety? Is it product development as it relates to mechanical engineering domains, or is it broader than that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I actually started my career at Dyson. After I graduated, I went for 2.5 years or so to Dyson, and because I love engineering. I still fundamentally am a bit of an engineering geek, right? And I always enjoyed that. So I started out that way, but I did want to kind of broaden my experience, and that was the reason for moving into consulting. At that time, so we're talking about sort of 2008, McKinsey was really one of the only big sort of business consultancies or cross-functional consultancies that really looked like they did proper operational work on real manufacturing or engineering topics in a serious way. Not just the strategy, but actually the sort of hands-on tactical stuff as well. And turned out to be true. Then indeed they did and do still work on that stuff. And that was what I focused on. So always, in when it comes to engineering, actually being hands-on with products, thinking about topics like design to value, design for manufacturing, design to cost, thinking about engineering transformations, so how to make the engineering function work better, and then through into manufacturing. So big lean transformations of manufacturing or production and supply chain functions. And I worked on these kind of topics across so many different industries. I've done everything from food and food packaging through to power stations and aircraft, right? And everything in between. Wow. over that period. So very, very broad.
Can that kind of background be useful in startups, do you think?
Yes, definitely. There are certain, there's two ways, right? There's two things. I think McKinsey and any of these consultancies, they do give you certain tools around structured thinking, problem solving, day-to-day team leadership, and these kind of topics, which are obviously helpful in any environment. The other thing is that it gives you a good picture of how different organizations work, what good looks like, what bad looks like, and some sort of very wide set of reference points of different ways that things might be done. And I think you can always take something from many of those, and from the individuals that you work with as well. It gives you a very fast, very broad exposure to a lot of different companies and leaders. And so this is, I think, very, very helpful to take as a set of reference points into a startup.
Yes. They get it. I think the strategy consulting firms, McKinsey being the bellwether for that industry, they're having a moment right now. Especially in the age of AI. I think for some time there have been questions as to how valuable that kind of background is to the startup community, with some being violently opposed to individuals or to skills from that background, and those feeling quite the opposite. And so it's interesting to hear your view. It sounds like, and my gut feel on it has always been that there is such a place. There is a place. They're going to expose you to amazing talent. They're going to expose you to best practice in some areas, not all of which are going to be immediately relevant. Right. But there's an exposure to quality, to an expansion of thinking, to different analytical tools, to pace, the importance of pace, because McKinsey is an organization, as I understand it, with pace. Pace is so important in these organizations. Pace and quality and precision and all of that, dealing with pressure. I think McKinsey is, those kinds of environments have those qualities. And if you're trying to create that kind of culture, if you want to create that kind of organization based on similar qualities or with similar features, it can be very helpful. I
think that's true. Actually, you do, and you have to work at pace in these consulting engagements, and to be able to do quite fast iterations of getting information, analyzing it in some way, producing some kind of output to explain it, and then working with a team to take a decision. That sort of loop, that loop, you need that in every business, right? And that's just a sort of fundamental mechanism of day-to-day work, in a sense. And
it is.
You need to be able to do that quickly in a startup in the same way. So that habit, let's call it a habit, I think is good.
Yeah. So you get to Lilium, you meet the founders. Where are they in their development and their thinking, and I guess their ambition when you go and meet with them?
Yeah, so Lilium was at a really interesting stage when I joined. So they were in a kind of shared working space. I think it was their first kind of proper office, let's say, with a workshop area attached, pretty small, pretty garage style setup, very startup-y from that point of view. Maybe about 30 people, I think, almost all in engineering, with a handful of people on the other business functions and production and so on. But they had just raised the first significant sum of money. And it was at that point where it was time to accelerate everything, basically. So it's a very, very exciting time. And they were just in the process of hiring the first few external senior leaders. So up until that point, the founders been running everything, and they actually continued to do so in certain teams for a little while. But that was the point when the first, sort of chief commercial officer, senior production people, senior program people, and so on started to come on board and take over certain functions and certain areas.
And in terms of their development, where were they by this point?
So they had the very first working prototype. That's probably wrong to say. Not the very first. They had a fairly large, fairly sophisticated early prototype, let's say, all off-the-shelf parts, lots of 3D printing. Again, bit garage style, handful of people had built it, in this little workshop. And they were in the process of engineering and then getting ready to build a much more serious, pretty much full-scale composite version prototype with a lot of in-house designed and developed systems in it. So really a transition from the kind of thing that, you can knock up pretty quick with a handful of people and, doesn't necessarily teach you much about the problem you're facing, to a quite serious prototype. I'd say TRL 5 or 6, perhaps, depending how you want to consider it, made in complex materials with suppliers getting involved and adding a lot of complexity to the whole production and supply chain system as well.
Yeah. What was as I look at Lilium, they had a number of innovations going on. They had, but I think it would be better if you kind of explain for everyone where you felt the innovation actually was. They had this, obviously, there's a vertical takeoff and landing piece. They were also thinking of an innovation around the air taxi. They weren't the only ones thinking of that, but air taxis were becoming a thing, were starting to become a thing.
Right.
So where did they see the innovation? Was it the air taxi? Was it the engine design and the lift and all of that? Was it something else?
Yeah, I think it's on the engineering side, right? I mean, obviously at that point in time, they were still one of the first people saying, okay, we believe that there's a market for this. So, now it's different, right? There's a lot of people following that, but they were definitely one of the pioneers for the business model. But really it was on the engineering side. And the whole aircraft architecture and the use of these relatively small ducted fans in a relatively high number, that's a very novel solution to the general problem of building a transition aircraft, right? And it's a very in many ways, it's a very elegant solution that has a bunch of advantages. So, and it's quite different to what anybody else was doing. Later on at my subsequent companies, I looked, across the industry a lot as part of the strategic part of my role, and we found that some of those decisions were very unusual, and there weren't a lot of precedents for, for example, using a large number of small ducted fans as some kind of array or arrangement. There's some studies, a lot of them done a long time ago, and so they were really doing some quite novel, almost science stroke early stage engineering research, as they were going through that phase. So
what kind of, generally for any deep tech company with a novel platform, they've got to do a minimum amount in order to attract, well, they've got to do a certain amount in order to attract the interest from industry, a certain amount of investment. Where was that line for Lilium? What was that kind of minimum amount that would have represented a stretch, but for which on the back of that milestone, they would have been able to start getting serious attention from the broader industry and, I don't know, maybe regulators and maybe partners and investors?
Yeah, so I think really that they had to have done enough to show that this architecture had some chance of being viable, right? And at that point, I wouldn't say, that perhaps except on paper, to some extent, they proved that it had the advantages that they wanted it to have. But they were at least able to make that argument to investors, to potential customers, and they were able to show the previous smaller prototypes that they'd built to say, look, okay, this might not be fully comparable to what we want in the long term, but at least it proves we're not crazy, right? I think that you kind of have to prove that you're not crazy. I think that's the first step. And I've come to feel more and more that it's quite important to think about why you're building the prototype that you are building. So are you doing it because you're solving some engineering problem or exploring some engineering problem and you want to have a reference point, excuse me, or something that you can test? Or are you actually building something because you want to show something representative or sexy to investors or potential customers? And very often they're not the same thing, unfortunately. And the greater the extent to which you can make them the same thing, the better, obviously, so that you're not wasting engineering time doing fancy things that don't teach you anything, or you're not doing, and I think maybe I'm wrong, probably more people fall in, well, actually, I'm going to comment further on this. So I was going to say that I think more people fall into the trap of just doing science and not doing enough to demonstrate that they're not crazy from a business perspective. And you do hear this anecdotally a lot, right? You hear investors on LinkedIn complaining that they talk to a engineering or science-based founder and they spent an hour talking about why their, engineering is so amazing and they didn't learn anything about what it's for. And it's very interesting, of course, to spend, and important to spend time on that stuff. And from an engineering development point of view, you have to do that. But it's not necessarily the right prototype or thing to put in front of these external parties. And the other direction is, of course, that you just build things that are effectively mock-ups of your final product. In aerospace, a good example is building a scale model, right? So You build something that looks exactly like your wonderful renderings, but it's only 1.5 meters wide instead of 15 meters wide. And this looks great. Actually, investors love this. Customers, you can fly it around. But the problem, not just in aerospace, but in many sort of aspects of engineering, is that the problems don't scale in that way. So you are very unlikely to learn much about building a 15-meter wingspan aircraft with real battery systems and so on by building a 1.5-meter remote control aircraft and flying it around. There's a few things you can learn, but a lot of the stuff, it just doesn't scale. So you just don't learn anything.
That's very interesting. So why is that? Is that just a function of the dynamics of air hitting the wings, or of the whole vehicle in operation? Because in other areas, when it comes to scaling up, that's true. You can, of course, it's always the trouble with scale up, that the larger scales you get to, the more demand it's going to make on the system itself. And then you can have material falling up, not working. You can have performance start to go awry. That's why you scale up, so that you can learn about that. So it's not unusual for scale ups to not perform, but it is usual for there to be an expectation that a smaller prototype is going to be a representation of some kind of a larger one.
Yes, there is, and it creates risk on both sides, right? If you're a customer or an investor and you see a scale model, you might think that more progress has been made than it really has, and vice versa. You might actually think that internally, although I think engineers and physicists are probably less prone to thinking that than some other people are. I think there's a bunch of reasons, right? Some things are just basic physics reasons, to do with fluid dynamics, to do with heat transfer. Some are more related to just things which have certain physical scaling properties, like, and I mean parts, right? Like batteries, for example. Battery cells only come in a finite range of sizes and physical arrangements. So it doesn't mean at all that the way they behave, or the way you can join them together, or the way you can thermally manage them, it doesn't mean at all that it scales from one size to another. And then there's all kinds of other odd things that are important to think about, like supply chain related things, right? So, in a lot of electric machines, power electronics, for example, cost is highly non-linear with power, in fact. So, if you think you're just going to get, as you start with something this big and it's off the shelf, and then I'm going to build my own one that's 10 times the size and 10 times the power, and it's going to cost linearly the same, that's wrong, right? So there are things which are maybe to do with the supply chain. There are things which are to do with regulation as well. Either, the things that you may learn from a scale model that are related to regulatory requirements, they may just not be applicable, or, when you discuss it with regulators, they may not accept that exploring it in that way is valid. So you have to be extremely careful on that side as well.
How far did Lilium get?
So this is an interesting and hotly debated topic. So for me, Lilium built and transitioned, and in this industry, transition flight means moving from vertical takeoff and landing mode to cruise flight mode. And that's the key sort of engineering deliverable in some senses, conducting that transition. They built a close enough to full scale prototype, which was able to perform this and able to fly around, right? And that's a huge engineering achievement, especially when almost everything is designed and built in-house and you have this very novel architecture. Interestingly, there is some argument as to whether that was a full-scale model or not, and that's partly to do with the fact that Lilium actually changed the final product definition during that period from a 4-seat aircraft to a 6-seat aircraft. And very wisely, I've subsequently looked into that question at Arrival and Skybridge, and my personal belief is 6 seats is much better, so very sensible thing to do. But that also ended up meaning that their prototype was no longer full scale or matched exactly to what they were selling to the world and to customers. And I suspect that on its own caused a bit of a problem, actually, in terms of the perception of how much progress they'd make, because people could look at that and say, well, you're showing me this thing flying, but it doesn't look like you're rendering anymore. So, how can I be sure that you're actually as far along that development journey as you claim to be? And, some of that happened after I left, so I couldn't comment to where they really got to at the end of that. But I think it probably caused unnecessary confusion in the wider world.
But it's easy to understand that happening. You can appreciate how that would happen, because as you scale, as you develop your platform further, changes are going to creep into the design. You're going to learn new things. And of course, we talk about mission creep and design creep over time, and we want to kind of avoid it. But equally, we can't, especially with novel technology and novel platforms, you can't always see what the end is going to look like. There's that. I can appreciate it from their perspective, that we thought it was going to be this. It's actually better with this. We don't have a prototype now, but we're actually making progress. This is part of the journey. This is part of that journey.
For sure.
But this is part of that journey. And I guess when I look at other lab to market journeys, which are as expensive and which are where you have the weight of expectations from so many different stakeholders, investors and partners. I know Lilium was signing from some fairly chunky deals too. At the end, They were signing some big deals for aircraft. And so you've got this growing sense of expectation. You've got to deliver on this.
Yep.
And yet you've also got to make the allowance for, hey, we're still learning as we develop this.
Yep.
So I think it puts that, as I reflect on that, it puts pressure on that CEO or on that management team and the board, I guess, to be communicating all the time of, hey, we're still learning here. We're still trying to get this. We are making progress, but it doesn't look like that anymore. But we're at least we're signing deals, and we're keeping confidence. But then, so it's about, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to kind of wrap in this. You've got to keep that trust with that community that you've built with these different stakeholders. You've got to keep that, and within a domain area like aerospace, I imagine that's so challenging, because everything in aerospace has got to be done to the nth degree, and for good reason.
And for good reason, and in a certain way, according to certain rules, even process-wise, right? And that's, of course, reassuring when you go on holiday. So it has to be like that. But I think that, it's very interesting, because in a sense, that was a kind of mini pivot, right? It was a sort of change, quite a big change in the product, and they would have had to start a lot of things from scratch on that new aircraft, on the 6-seat one, from an engineering point of view. But they would have had a lot of very valuable and valid learnings from the other prototypes. So it's by no means going back to the drawing board, and it's absolutely the right thing to do. As you were kind of alluding to at the beginning, the cost of doing that in terms of program timeline, opportunity cost, financial cost of prototype building and so on is huge in a deep tech, in a physical product company, right? You can do that pivot pretty much for free in software, but it's obviously not the same when you're building something. So it does create risk. And I'm sure there were many discussions about whether or not to bin the smaller prototypes and to try to build something quickly representative of the 6-seat version.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's that communication piece we talk about a lot, and it's kind of a truism. Communication is one of the most important features of good quality leadership. But if you've got young founders who haven't been trained before, or who are just not mature enough or not experienced enough, and I don't know what kind of communicators these guys were. Maybe they were great communicators. Maybe they were amazing at all of this. But you see really experienced executives, mature executives who've been around and who've got a reasonable level of emotional intelligence. You see them struggle with this kind of thing, in all kinds of industries. But here, it's so important. Again, it's not just the fact that you're the innovator and you can Elon Musk it and go through walls and everyone's going to listen to you and drop what they're doing and do as you say. You're not going to get industries to wrap around you. Even Elon can't do that. So you've got to, I think, bear that in mind for young founders and CEOs who are thinking about growing their deep tech teams and companies and innovations, thinking about how they're going to keep it all together. I think building that line of communication, that trust is so critical.
And I think something I've learned subsequently, and I wasn't as close, at Lilium, I wasn't involved in sort of investor discussions and so on, but subsequently I have been, and I think it's very helpful to discuss explicitly what it is that people want to see or understand. Customers as well, right? What is it for them that means progress, actually? What is it that, after you've explained the engineering or regulatory journey that you're on, and you've said, okay, here are the things that I think we should care about, and these are the KPIs and goals that I have, you need to hear what they think, because of their background or their own understanding or their goals, they might want something completely different. And that doesn't make it wrong. They're just using different senses almost to make their judgments about where you are and whether you're succeeding or not. And so I think that's a very valuable kind of conversation to have. Of course, you can't give, if you have 10 investors and 10 potential customers and everybody wants 10 different things, you can't give people 1,000 different pieces of information about the company every month, right? That's just not practical. But there's some sort of balance there.
Yeah. How was it at Arrival? Tell me a little bit about when you joined. Where was the company?
Yeah. So Arrival was very interesting. So I joined Arrival to work on a sort of secret stealth mode aerospace project within the group company, right? I worked a little bit in the central strategy team across automotive sides as well, and then latterly almost all on this aerospace topic. So some things were still very small and very young. So the group company that I joined had maybe 12 people at that time. Very early stage engineering development. The teams working on the van and the bus that Arrival had were, maybe between 10, 15 to sort of 40, 50 people at that time. Again, still, not that big. Arrival as a whole had already grown quite big because there were lots of things going on within that company. Lots of amazing technology development and very interesting things. But here we're going to come to that question about focus. So in terms of products, and the first product that Arrival had sold really to a customer was the van, right? The electric van. That was at a pretty early stage, right? There was some early stage working prototypes, some, sort of skateboards that drove around on their own, and some mock-ups of the cabin, and this kind of stage. So really pretty early.
And just to be clear, and for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, Arrival was about electric vehicles, and in particular vans, and different types of delivery vans, as I understand it. And then it was also about, obviously, the secret stealth thing that you were working on in aerospace. And this was a very cool innovation I remember thinking about at the time, the concept of a microfactory.
Yes, and so this is a whole we could probably have a whole other hour on the concept of the microfactory. Arrival had this was a commercial electric vehicle company at core, right? The bus and the van were the first products. Part of the concept was to be extremely vertically integrated. So to do, down to a very low level of engineering development in-house, software, battery systems, motors, gearboxes, composite materials, almost everything Arrival was trying to do in-house. And Lilium was as well, to be fair. So a lot of innovation going on at that system level too. And then this whole idea of the microfactory. And I'll say something quickly about that, maybe to set the context. As I say, it's a pretty big topic. The idea was to make modular, highly automated manufacturing cells, a combination of cells that could produce the majority of the vehicle in an automated way, and to scale up by replicating these cells. And this is actually, so it's completely the opposite of the gigafactory, right? It's completely the opposite of the sort of Musk vision. The reason that it's very interesting, especially in these kind of companies, and we, my current company, we've been taking this forward, and I do believe it's a good strategy. When you don't know how fast your industry is going to scale up, it's a very bad idea to spend $1 billion on a factory which builds your whole future volume in 1 year, right? This is just a recipe for wasting tons of money. It's a much better idea to try to build something that can build maybe 10 units a year or 20 units a year, and to be able to scale that up as the demand grows, right? So this is a sort of basic idea. And I think there's something very, very smart and sensible in that. I think the risk, and part of what happened in Arrival's case, was it was also extremely ambitious in terms of automation and engineering development for the manufacturing itself. And that's not necessarily wrong, but it does absorb a lot of resource, and it makes it quite slow and challenging to ramp up production. So it comes with trade-offs.
Yeah. Because you are trying to innovate the way you're producing these vehicles.
At the same time,
you're just trying as you're trying to make a vehicle.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to, and that's the problem with these, well, that's the challenge, I should say, with the vertical integration.
Yeah, right.
They were also involved in a lot of activities. They were doing a lot. And I remember that at the time, you were always, it was inspiring to read about, but it did make you wonder, these are big innovations they're trying to get to market here. How many of these can they realize? Can they do it all at once? If you look at Elon, he did the production line, he did his kind of, gigafactory and so on, but then he focused on that first car. And that was it. It was one car and this production line. And
I think that's very important, right? I think, having all of these different activities and these different ambitious products and things being developed, technologies, it was doing lots of good things, right? It was building a huge IP base. It was building a big potential advantage for the future in lots of different areas. It was also making it a really cool and exciting place to work, right? And that's not a negligible consideration. On the other hand, as you say, I think it was probably quite distracting from delivering the vehicle that had been sold. And that creates, that creates a huge risk, right? Interestingly, it's only occurred to me the other day, but when I joined Dyson, so my first job was 20 years or so ago, Dyson had in early stage R&D pretty much an entire portfolio of household goods. Right? At that point in time, they had only the vacuum cleaner and the washing machine on the market. I don't know if you remember the contra-rotating washing machine, very fascinating and cool product. Didn't last that long, but very interesting. But the sort of strategy seemed to be to develop the whole lot: tumble dryer, dishwasher, kettle, ceiling fan, rice cooker. There was all kinds of mad stuff going on in R&D, and just launch them all to market at once. Because I don't know, because it's my first job, right? I wasn't involved in those decisions, but I guess the strategy might have been, well, okay, Bosch or whoever, they're going to copy whatever we do. And if we only launch one product at a time, they'll just copy that one product quite fast, and they'll steal away, the market share that we've developed. If we launch the whole suite in one go, even a huge company won't be able to replicate all of that in any quick time frame. So it's going to capture a whole bigger market for us. So there was all this crazy stuff going on, and I was working on some of these things. It was very, very interesting. And many of those things died out before they got anywhere. And I do think this was something that Dyson was exceptional, and it seems to still be very good at from the outside, is killing stuff when a relatively small amount of resource has been put into it. And I think that's so important, knowing when to stop a particular activity, when to kill a particular avenue of experimentation, is one of the most important decision-making processes and skills that an organization can have, a deep tech organization. And it's not just at the whole product level, right? It's within a single product as well. It's like, okay, we've got two options for this engineering decision. Let's quickly build a prototype of both, do some testing, we'll find out which one works. Fine, maybe, but know when to stop pursuing one of those avenues and just focus on the one.
Is that something taught in engineering management? Did you see that at work at McKinsey, where you would have gotten to see this in effect, lots of different engineering organizations, I'm assuming? And is that considered a part of best practice?
Yeah, I would say it is considered a part of best practice, and there are, lots of different frameworks and so on that people use to look at these kind of things. I think it's one of those areas where having that knowledge or even that framework or process is only a small part of the battle. I think the thing is, and everybody kind of knows this, as an engineer or a product developer or a business owner, CEO, you grow attached to your ideas, right? And as a curious person, you also grow attached to the process of learning something and experimenting with it. So if it feels like something is maybe it's not exactly what you wanted, but these two pathways are still quite interesting, it's kind of tempting just to have people still working on both, right? Or it's kind of tempting to think, okay, well, there's something in this. Let's, spin off this little other idea, and maybe we'll develop that for a future project line or something like this. And it's just, very hard not to do that. And I don't think it's wrong to do that. I just think I think the best thing to do is somehow the easiest thing to do is not overthink it, but just to make sure you have some kind of mechanism for checking what are we actually spending time developing? Where is the resource deployed across the whole organization? Usually we're talking about engineering resource of some kind at these early stage companies. And let's sense check that once a month or once a quarter at a high level, whatever works, and just look at that and openly discuss it. Does it make sense that we've still got 3 people spending 2 days a week on, some side avenue of experimentation that we were using 6 months ago? Or we've still got 25 engineers working on their vertical integration, the in-house version of a motor or something like this. Does it still make sense? Because it's about reducing the cost of changing your decision, right? And that the sooner you detect that you might be spending resource somewhere that's not valuable, the better it is. You need to learn as soon as you can that you've maybe done something wrong, and then you can redirect the resources.
I wonder if this feels to me a lot like a leadership issue, in that leadership always has to be doing this. They always have to be asking themselves the question of, you said it earlier, what are we focused on? What are we trying to do here? What is our goal? We can't be doing everything. So what are the few things we can be doing right now that are going to get us to our goal? Everything that falls outside of that, we leave for now, or we put on ice, or we, or we spin out, and, whatever. But and I wonder, these organizations, Lilium and Arrival, they both raised a lot of money. They had some smart people working there, really experienced managers and leaders, and lots of smart engineers, and people across different domains, really smart people. So it's not a function of the lack of experience. It's not a function of people with the right backgrounds and skills. They've got them.
No.
But yet they all get together under this banner, under this umbrella where there's lots of resource and lots of different projects. And it doesn't work. And I wonder, is it something structural? Like when you raise so much money, you lose that sharpness. You stop asking yourselves those important questions with that sense of urgency lacing through it. I wonder if it's in the way that power corrupts. I wonder if too much capital raised doesn't corrupt, but it stops us being so sharp.
Definitely creates some kind of risk, right? You do see evidence for this all the time, and I get that, right? It's maybe you do lose just, it's not good to be constantly kind of on the breadline as a company either, because, having a little bit of breathing space helps with other things, right? It helps with stress levels. It helps with, not being distracted from, for example, as an engineering leader, being distracted by worrying about whether I can afford to have a certain prototype built or whatever. That's not helpful. But it's also not helpful to not spend any mental energy on these kind of decisions because you think, oh, well, it only costs £1 million to do that. And I'm not saying anybody really thinks like that, but maybe a tiny part of your brain does do that, right? Oh, it was only a couple of $100,000 to build that test rig. Let's do it anyway. That is also for sure not very healthy. So it's really hard, right? It's I'm sure there's no right way to do it, but
I think you're right. I think that's it. And so then the question is kind of, where do you draw that line? Mm-hmm. Where do you draw that line? How much money is too much money? Or does it come back to leadership again? And does it come back to, I don't know if it's the CFO saying, we've raised a lot of capital, we have a lot of capital, but we're going to act like we're poor. We're going to eliminate the stress people have. So let's not make it stressy, because stressy is a bit shit. And people feel, they can't relax and so on. So
you won't get good work in that.
You're not going to get, I agree. You don't get good work if people are stressy, so we're going to remove that stressy feeling. But we're not going to, if you have to, we're not also going to say, oh, it's only £1 million, forget it, let's just do it. We're not going to get to that point either. So, but that comes down to, I think, those values and that sense of, appreciation, that if we let this get to our head, and you see this happening right now in an extraordinary way in AI, holy cow, AI is just the amounts they're raising. It's a new world. But I think we have to be aware as humans, and regardless of how experienced and how smart we are, we can forget very quickly. We can lose ourselves in the moment.
True.
And even if we are surrounded by a bunch of colleagues who are super bright and experienced, but you all bring us together and here's a whole basket of money, go play. A lot of that discipline is going to go out the window. And I think that's just a function of who we are.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. It's just having, like anything that's to a certain extent human nature, it's about having that awareness that is a problem and a risk, right? So that you do talk about it as a leadership team. And I also think, as you were talking there, I was thinking about responsibility for money and how do you realize that in the organization? Because I think doing things that make individuals at a relatively low organizational level, giving people genuine responsibility for managing the money that they are spending in some sense is really important with this. If everything just flows up to the CFO and the CEO, in some ways it might make you feel comfortable because every decision is going to get signed off by this person and therefore we're fine because that person won't waste any money. But the problem with that is that nobody else in the company feels any responsibility for managing the money, right? So everybody just does whatever they want and hopes that if it's not sensible, it'll get stopped at the, or vice versa, right? It's almost like a game. It's like, let's see if we can, buy this cool piece of equipment, and if she's not going to notice, then it's all good, right? But then I think that certainly doesn't work. So I don't have an answer, of course, but I think that trying to devolve responsibility to the front line of whatever it is that's happening, engineering, product. This is always a good idea, right? But I think it's a good idea in terms of managing money as well, because then everybody is thinking about, okay, well, maybe there's a different way to do this, or I shouldn't have hired that contractor to do that, or I don't actually need this tool or whatever. And you take much smarter decisions closer to the action than you do as just managing all that stuff within what inevitably is a relatively small finance function.
Why you were at Arrival for much longer than Lilium, but what ultimately, in your view, what were the reasons it didn't work out?
I think I feel that not enough of the resources and the money were focused on the product that had been sold. Actually, you have to get to revenue, right? This is the ultimate challenge of a deep tech company, getting to revenue before you run out of money, obviously. And this is the sort of valley of death that many people fall into. And part of avoiding that is just making sure that every penny is spent on the thing that's going to return the pennies in the short period of time. And I think this was in the end the challenge. And I think something that I've thought about a lot during this journey, and because of Arrival's level of vertical integration, and we've been taking a similar approach in my current company latterly, is to think about is there something on the technology journey that you're on that you can monetize before your final product?
Yeah.
Without having to do very much incremental engineering or incremental production work. It'll never be zero, and you'll always be diverting resources a little bit. But the earlier that you can get to some sort of revenue, I believe that's better. If I were to try to build a company developing some kind of very large, complex product, I would be thinking a lot about that. Like, can we break that journey down into steps, whereby each of those steps can be something we can actually make money from?
Yeah. We've talked about that a bit on this podcast. We had actually, and in one area where they really need it, in the fusion area. So we had David Kingham, who's the vice chair of Tokamak Energy. They're building spherical tokamaks that contain plasma and create the conditions necessary for fusion. But fusion is such a moonshot deep tech domain. It's like quantum. And so it really applies in that area. Whereas it's going to be so long before we are generating revenue from generating electricity from fusion. So what the heck can we do in the meantime to generate any kind of value?
Yeah.
So, and their answer was, we have to act as a provider to the rest of the fusion industry, whether that's so we have to get something, be it our high temperature superconducting magnets, or other advanced materials, or other technology. We've got to become a supplier to what will at some point be an industry. And that is fusion. And so that's their answer to that. And I think there are lots of other examples, along that journey. But I think it's a really good point. I think, especially for deep tech, I think that may be part of the journey they have to, these companies have to think through, which is, okay, here's our big goal over here. That's 10 years away.
Right.
What can we do in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years that won't deviate us too much from our plan, but that allows us to demonstrate progress, to generate some kind of revenue, and to continue broadly, and to be able to maintain the confidence of our stakeholders. So much of the lab to market journey is about maintaining that confidence, maintaining the trust and confidence of all of your different stakeholders. You're going to have a lot, but you've got to keep doing it. And I think it's such a, it's a taxing job. It's a taxing job.
Yeah, I think that's one of those kind of tricks that's quite difficult, isn't it? I think there's on this topic there are some other interesting things that you can do in terms of making revenue from deep tech companies earlier on, right? One of the things that we've done recently is basically sell spare prototype production capacity, and it's a little bit different because it's not like launching a product. It doesn't necessarily bring you a large and continuous revenue stream, but it does mean that you're not wasting sort of underutilized talent or physical space or production equipment, and that you're getting some kind of revenue in. And something like that is also quite interesting, because if you're in a prototype environment, one of the important things that you'll be thinking about, obviously, is how am I transitioning to series production, and how am I thinking about things like quality, cost control, inventory control, all the things that matter when you're producing tens of thousands of units that are either easy or they don't matter that much when you're just building a prototype. And the discipline of having a customer who's ordered something that has, specific requirements and they're going to pay you money for it, producing that in your prototyping environment, I think is very good for the production organization to experience as a part of the journey to sort of stabilized high volume manufacturing.
But you're delivering prototypes for them.
Yeah, for other people, right? In our case, we built up quite a lot of composite manufacturing capability, some processes that are not easy to do, and we're able to do stuff at high quality. And there's lots of demand for that, right? There are lots of people who will never build that kind of stuff up in-house, and they want a few composite parts for prototypes or for small production runs. And we were able to do some of that work for other people, and when we had the time.
Yeah, I know. I have a client that I think has started out that way, doing just that kind of thing. They're based in Oxford, and actually, they're one of the. I think they started out. So I'll refrain from mentioning their name in the event that they didn't. But I think in the very early days, that's how they got some early traction by doing that, and it did sharpen them. I think. Sure. I think the danger that I think the pit they potentially fell into in this is that if that becomes a reasonable source of revenue for you, it may prevent you from really selecting your core application and product area because you're busy delivering on the service. And so at some point, a company has to choose, what are we going to make? What's our product to market, as opposed to, so it's always, so again, but it comes down to leadership at the end, which is we're heading in this direction. We'll do this for now, but only for now.
Yeah, only for now. That's the thing, isn't it? I've seen some companies. I think it can be when you're very small and are some kind of engineering startup, and you're maybe you're at seed stage and you're thinking about little bits of fundraising here and there. It can be very tempting to sell engineering as consultancy, right? Because if you've got a few people in your team. A small engineering consultancy is actually quite a nice business. It can be very easily self-sustaining, make a little bit of profit. There's lots of demand for it. It's lovely, right? So it can be quite tempting. And I definitely have seen and know people who have done that, started to sell that kind of work. But then you never develop the product that you've dreamed of, right? You never pursue the vision of whatever it is that you're trying to bring into the world. So it's
that's right.
Risky distraction.
Right. James, I've really enjoyed this. It's been
Me too.
And I've really learned a lot. So thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure. Very, very interesting topics, and lots that could go on for even longer.
Yeah, I know. It's always the way. But thank you so much for contributing to this.
My pleasure, Chris. My pleasure.
You've been listening to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Deep Tech Leaders. This podcast has been produced by Bauhaus. You can find out more about us on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.